So Adam, are clients exposed because of advisor data security malpractice?
The data security conversation is hitting us a whole many ways, but I have to tell you, there's some good stuff that's happening and there's some really bad stuff that's happening. And I think what has been positive in the industry, not only being a financial advisor myself, but also leading a fintech company, is we've seen enormous awareness and prioritization of protecting client data. And we're seeing this not only from a policy standpoint, but from an expectation across industry. As you probably know, the industry has put huge expectations of the fintech companies that control data, making it harder and harder for a company that just starts up as an idea in someone's garage to now all of a sudden have client data. So the expectations of the fintech companies that are really managing and protecting a lot of this data has really gone through the roof. We've seen implementations of SOC 2 Type 2 requirements, following a good number of the protocols that have been used institutionally, ISO standards, as requirements to doing any business with some financial advisors in many firms. And this is going to continue to get much more strict. And I think it's important for any financial advisor out there to think about, where am I putting client data? Because there is clearly an exposure that comes back to the advisor if in fact there is a breach. And we're talking exposures in the billions of dollars if in fact there is a leak. Of course, the PR nightmare that any advisor would have if their companies that they worked with had a leak for client data that they chose to put on that platform. So the good thing that's happening is that we're seeing a great amount of awareness, insurance protections around this being mandated, as well as protocols, including downstream data protection agreements that when data moves from system to system, we know where it's coming from and we know what the exposure is. This is a really interesting thing that AssetMap has been focusing on, really ahead of the curve, to make sure that we're thinking, where does the data that we're collecting from all of these different sources really potentially go? And are we blocking it from leaving our world? Here's the failure that's happening. A lot of advisors don't recognize is that the real point of failure is likely on the human side. There's been a lot of work done, I think, on the awareness around phishing and cybersecurity that can be managed at the individual level. But one thing that we do know advisors tend to do is they tend to ignore the human element and exposure, not just of themselves, but maybe their teams and their staff. Throughout history, a lot of individuals who could share licenses for software where a lot of this data could live has been pretty much commonplace, right? Why buy a license when you can share that license amongst multiple people and spread the cost? Where the exposure, though, is coming up and becoming more and more obvious is that this is outside of policy. Think about it for yourself. We have great policies for info security, but then what's the practice? In real practice, sometimes we'll call it a little bit of give me room. We make concessions that may be easier to do. And I think there's a real kind of impending problem that's going to just hit many advisors, which is they're giving logins to sensitive client information to individuals who may not have their best interests in mind. In other words, we've seen situations where advisors have given logins to personal information to their staff because they're sharing logins and they have no way of really locking themselves out, and losing information on social security numbers, account numbers, bad actors, deleting data, and so forth. And without any real audit history of who did what, that responsibility all falls back on the advisor. So there could be bad actors, there could be just unknowns, there could be employees who are not following policy or protocol and potentially expose client data from losing their laptops and so forth. So there's some real big risks and holes. It turns out most of them come down to the individual. And what are the practices that we're all going to require and inspect to make sure that we're protecting that downstream client data so that it doesn't come back on us big time?
Interesting. So what can clients do to ensure their advisors are actually following these policies?
That's a great question. Clients tend to make the assumption that the policies and the procedures are all being followed, but it's not necessarily an inspectable process. There are very few advisors we've seen out there that are able to provide to their clients even an audited or an inspected SOC 2 Type 2 or their own type of inspection from a compliance auditor or otherwise that says, yes, they are following these policies. And yes, they have a procedure for inspecting it and auditing it. That really has never been something that many clients would have gone to their advisor and said, how are you protecting my data? The presumption is if you don't protect the data, it's the end of your business. So you have a best interest for yourself to do it. But there's really not a mechanism for inspecting this. There's a lot of trust in the system. I don't know the last time any of us went to our bank and said, what are you doing to protect our data? They give us a policy, a privacy policy, and a whole bunch of documents that say what they should do. Now the question is, are they doing what they should do? That's a whole nother question. And so I think it's incumbent to imagine about what if a client came to me in my practice and said, what are you doing about data security? And when was the last time you inspected? And are you sharing logins? And how are you protecting my data specifically? Who has access to my data? I think it's an interesting question that advisors need to ask themselves.
Absolutely. So what would you suggest that advisors do to ensure they're building that trust with their clients?
Well, the first question is, can I even answer that question, or where would I start? I think the advisors can really think about, can I actually prove that I have a policy? If we were to ask you right now, what's your data protection policy and procedures? Do you have that documented? That's the first step. Is it now communicated on a regular basis with your employees that have access to said personal information? And do you have an ongoing testing regimen that tests to see that this is in fact working? Whether it's a fire drill audit, let's just look and see right now what you're doing. And I think one of the biggest questions that I think becomes inspectable is this whole audit of logins. We've seen a good number of people using LastPass and password authenticators basically to try to manage logins, either through single sign-in security. You have to go through a portal and you can cut somebody's access to multiple systems in one fell swoop. I think that's an important aspect of this. But I think it's also to do your own, we'll call it inspection of what critical systems have an audit trail that can be inspected. For example, if there is in fact a breach that is a human error, does it track back to the advisor, or does it track to an individual employee or bad actor? And if we're continuing to just share logins to save the capital costs in it, I'm telling you that the implication of having a breach like this that can't be tracked to the person's activity because they are all using the same login is a huge potential problem for which there are fines that are immeasurable, potentially even business ending.